Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the effects of Napoleon, right? We are still in the middle of this flip talking about the effects of Napoleon, talking about industrialization, all those different isms. But let's dive right into it real quick because in fifth period, I somehow lost track of time and didn't cover anything. So we need to go over that real quick. But remember what I said in class, Amy. Remember, in about 15 minutes, even if it goes a little bit over, you're going to stop this flip and you're going to answer a couple questions on a Google form, and that's all you have to do for class, right? Isn't it right, PP? Isn't it right? Now, here we go. Let's go ahead and dive headfirst into it, though, and talk about the effects of Napoleon on more of a worldwide scale, right? Now, we talked about this in first period and stuff like that, so if y'all need to fast forward to the other slides that you don't recognize and stuff like that, just go ahead and bang that out. So what you need to understand, though, is that there was a worldwide effect of Napoleon, okay? It didn't just create isms inside of Europe. It's also going to create a disruption of the colonial system, right? Do me a favor real quick and write that down real fast. Just write, Napoleon severely disrupted the colonial system worldwide, right? What is going to end up happening is basically Napoleon and all of his wars that he's going to wage throughout Europe is going to lead shockwaves throughout Europe, leading to the point where they can't really necessarily control all these colonies and places they took over, right? You're going to see this happen in South America when they go from looking actually like a concentrically controlled by Spain entity to where they're actually going to be basically a bunch of independent countries led by Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. All right, now, but we're also going to talk about a different example real fast. We're going to talk about the example of Hispaniola, right? Just so you understand this really quick, Hispaniola is an island in the Caribbean. It looks like this. Now, in the modern day era, it's got two different countries on it, all right? The island of Hispaniola has two different countries on it. Those two countries include Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? So what we're going to do real quick is we're going to talk about how Napoleon and his actions are going to lead to the outlawing of slavery in Saint-Domingue, right? Now, really quickly, Saint-Domingue is this side right here. That is the Haitian side of the island. This is the Sorry about that. That is the Dominican Republic side of the island. Now, before Haiti became Haiti, it was referred to as Saint-Domingue, right? It was known as Saint-Domingue, and it was a heavy plantation economy that was used to farm a lot of sugarcane and coffee, right? And so the French really wanted to hold on to it, and they used slave-based systems to create these products, which is absolutely disgusting because slavery is the worst thing that has ever existed in human history. Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is because the slave systems are so bad on this island, they're going to see frequent amounts of slave revolts, right? The slaves would frequently revolt against imperial rule and against French rule and try to weaken or dismantle the system the best they could, leading to the establishment of Maroons and several other things. But one day when this man shows up, a man by the name of Toussaint L'Ouverture, right? A former slave himself, right? Toussaint L'Ouverture was actually born on this place known as the Breda Plantation that was actually in Saint-Domingue, right? Saint-Domingue, remember, is going to be the name of Haiti before it becomes Haiti. Now, Toussaint L'Ouverture, though, will actually is going to become very educated. He will eventually be freed by the man that owned the plantation. Now, what also will happen is he gets educated in the ways of the Enlightenment and realizes later on that, wait a minute, this can be done, right? He realizes that we can eradicate slavery in this island if we organize these slave revolts, right? So he uses his education, he uses everything he's learned to organize a massive slave revolt that broke out in the 1790s that was over 100,000 strong, and he leads the actual National Assembly to abolishing slavery. Now, why would they do this, you might ask? It's mostly due to the fact that his revolt was so successful that he was taking over huge chunks of the island, right? And this little imaginary line right here that separates Santo Domingo on this side that was controlled by Spain and Saint-Domingue that was controlled on this side by France is very important, because what ends up happening is Toussaint Louverture's revolt was so successful that he actually ends up getting it liberated, and the Spanish government makes him an officer in their army, right? Which is absolutely wild. But to keep it from going to the Spanish, the French decide to play ball with Toussaint Louverture and actually end slavery, and they abolish it in 1794. Now, what interestingly enough happens, though, is after Napoleon becomes leader of France after 1799, when he overthrows the government in his coup d'etat, he attempts to bring slavery back in this place, right? That is where he did this. When we talked about the positives and negatives, especially whenever he tried to bring back slavery and eradicated women's rights, that is going to be the location. This is where it happens, right? But what ends up happening, though, also, is he captures Toussaint Louverture, Napoleon does, has him arrested, then has him put into the French Alps, where he then later dies. And so a second series of revolts was led by this guy, a man by the name of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, which is like the right-hand man of Toussaint Louverture, right? His second-in-command general, who actually leads a ferociously violent overthrow of the entire island, killing and eradicating anybody that was associated with the former plantation system, and also destroying destroying the French military that was dying of yellow fever. Now, interesting thing about it as well is that Toussaint Louverture, who literally was originally named Toussaint Breda, and his last name was changed to Louverture, which means opener of doors in French. What you have to understand that he does is he actually was very kind when he was actually sweeping through the entire area, and he was telling the plantation owners, you can leave, right? It wasn't an extremely violent person. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, though, grew up on a plantation that was extremely violent, and so he led a very ferocious and violent takeover of the island, leading eventually to Napoleon realizing it wasn't worth holding on to anymore, and so it became an independent country in 1804 under the name of Haiti, right? And so that was actually done on the second half by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, right? Now what we need to do is we're going to switch over on these prezzies real quick. Here we go. We're going to hop over from here and then jump to this one where we're going to begin to talk about a lot of crazy stuff that's going to be going on in the 1800s in Europe, right? So what you need to understand when we're actually analyzing this right here, this is where first period, you should be back in action right now, right? Back in action over here. So what ends up going down though as well is we're going to see these massive changes continue to spiral forward inside of Europe during the 1800s. And Europe is changing so much during the 1800s, right? Industrialism is now leaving England and is beginning to spread throughout the continent, taking rural agrarian lifestyles that most people actually lived like this, turning it more into a factory-based system that looks like this, right? When they're actually sitting inside of factories and dwelling away, and they're also going through all these crazy different changes, and we're seeing that the factory conditions are really awful and stuff like that, and you're also seeing massively urbanized cities, leading to pollution and also a very, just not very good lifestyle for a bunch of people living on top of each other. And so the thing about it is that the age of Metternich, that 1815 to 1848 year time span, might have been light on international war, but it was high in political turmoil. Because if you take people from agrarian settings like these, where they lived a decent life, and put them in factories like these, right, that are being overworked, and slam them into cities like these because they have nowhere else to go to find labor, people are going to get a little upset, right? And so what ends up happening is there's a lot of revolts and protests and things like that. So there was a lot of political turmoil going on. And so yes, in the age of Metternich, they weren't fighting each other, but there was a lot of crushing of revolts and crushing of protest movements, right? Because conservatives want social order and absolutism back. The liberals want legislative bodies, voting a little bit for some, right? So, and then also economic independence. And the workers or the socialists want food, better working conditions, and food. Yeah, because like bread, always going to be a big stimulant to a lot of the things going on in Europe, right? So going forward as well, what you have to understand is that, yes, again, no wars were happening between countries. Parts of Latin America are beginning to liberate itself, but Europe is in turmoil within each country, right? France, for example, to show you or demonstrate to you just how chaotic some things were inside of the borders of some of these countries, France went through not one, but 3 kings in 30 years, which is a lot of kings in 30 years. Some of you are like, that doesn't feel like that much. Well, just to try and throw it out there, Louis XIV ruled for 70 years on his own, right? So that was one guy that ruled for 70 years. They went through 3 guys in 30 years. And it all has to do with the fact that literally they kept making people mad, right? This guy right here was Louis XVIII, and he actually just ends up dying from wet and dry gangrene, but his brother, Charles X, took over, who was an absolute conservative jerk, right? He tried to take over Algeria. He started trying to give death penalties for people who stole church objects, and the people couldn't stand him so much that they went into the streets and had a massive protest, leading to him to abdicating the throne for this guy, a guy by the name of Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, right? So like now, that was a really big moment. That literally revolts and protests led to the King of France running away and the end of the Bourbon dynasty. By the way, fun fact, there was a Louis the 19th, and he was in between those guys, and he was actually only king for about 20 minutes. But what we need to use this as an example of, these 3 guys right here, is that this middle guy came in as a conservative and started trying to pass a lot of these really intense laws, taking and stripping people's rights away. And the people of France are going to get so mad that they're going to build barricades in the streets and freak out, and then they end up actually like attacking the military and stuff, leading to him to get so scared, because what happened the last time, children, that the French people got mad at their king? That dude ended up headless because of the guillotine, right? So you have to understand, yes, the conservatives are trying to crush a lot of this stuff, but they also have to remember, the conservatives do, that if enough people get really mad, things could spell and go bad for you, right? Liberals and liberal ideas of constitutional government are beginning to spread. The thing about it is like I said, Napoleon and the French Revolution have opened up a can of worms, right?
God, can open worms everywhere?
Exactly. Thank you, Chandler from Friends. All right, so now what you have to understand is they have opened up a can of worms that they cannot put back in, right? And the idea is that people believe now that they can actually get a constitution. They believe in that they can get more rights. They believe that they can get more things. They believe that their government should better represent them, right? So what's going to end up happening is countries like Austria and Prussia and Italy and England also and Russia also are going to see small revolts, right? So revolts, mostly peasants, are blowing up everywhere because of this. Good examples of this include the Peterloo Massacre, the Decemberist revolts, and the Three Glorious Days, right? Now, looking at these little examples real quick, the Peterloo one was absolutely wild, is when several thousand people assembled inside of a field in Manchester, England, and they were protesting limited to no voice in their government, no voting rights, these things called the Corn Laws, right? And they wanted a big change in their government, and they wanted to have more participation. Well, the military gets sent, and they run over a bunch of people with a bunch of horses and stuff, and the very first person to die when the military was sent in to crush this revolt was actually a 10-month-old child that was knocked out of her mother's arms, right? This blew up in the news, forcing the government of, like, England to actually give them some more, like, stuff, more rights, and to actually enact some change, like in the Great Reform Law of, I believe, 1820. I'll have to look that up, though. So, like, now, going into it, though, the Decemberist revolt was another big one, where basically what ended up happening is the King of Russia died, or the Tsar of Russia died, and he had two sons, Constantine and Nicholas, right? Constantine is the one the military wanted because he was progressive and liberal and awesome. But what did it ended up getting? Nicholas, right? Because Constantine said, I don't want the throne. I think I'm not going to do it. And he advocated behind closed doors. Well, a bunch of the military officers were like, well, we want Constantine and we refuse to fight for Nicholas. So when they all assembled inside of a square inside of Russia, they brought in the rest of the army and they shot them and exiled a bunch of them to Siberia and then also hung the 5 leaders of the entire movement, right? That's pretty messed up. And then this right here is the Three Glorious Days, which actually is the reason, right? A very violent revolt that took place over 3 days, July 26, 27, and 28 of 1830, inside of France, that is going to lead that king to running away and like Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, to coming in, right? So going in, you have to understand is you take all that stuff, right? You take those big revolts going on. You take this scary stuff happening. You take the movements of you take like Haiti, like getting a slavery abolished. You've got Latin America liberating itself. You got people having protests, and then couple it with one other thing. And you've got a pot that is fixing to boil over, right? It's about to boil over and sweep through the continent, and everyone's going to freak out. But add one more thing into the mix, one more ingredient that will cause it to go and just go everywhere. It is none other than this thing called the Hungry 40s, right? Because the 1840s will see a sweeping problem of food prices skyrocketing and people not being able to feed their families, right? So aptly named the Hungry 40s, right? In the 1840s, most of this will be caused by one key singular event. From 1845 to 1849, something known as the Irish Potato Blight, or the Irish Potato Famine, or the Great Famine actually came through and is going to lead bread prices soaring, all right? Because the problem is what caused this, right? Well, that's a big, that's a great question, y'all. Absolutely appreciate you asking it. What you need to understand is that the Irish potato blight is an illness that affected potatoes, right? So what you have to understand about that is it's a fungal infection that actually affected the potatoes that are being grown in Ireland. Well, some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, was everybody eating potatoes? But if it only happened to the Irish, then why is it such a big deal? Well, check this out. The reason why is because the Irish people were eating the potatoes. But what were they farming is the key thing. They were farming a massive amount of wheat and grain that was being used to make bread in bread stores and reserves, not only in Ireland, but also in the United Kingdom and southern parts of Northern Europe. Now, what ends up happening, though, when all your workers are dying because they're starving to death because their potatoes are all going rotten, issue being is because of mass production farming and stuff like that, that's going to be a big problem. So when your workers are starving, they're not harvesting wheat. If the wheat is not being harvested, it's not being ground into flour. If the flour is not happening, it's not being made into bread. If the bread's not around, the supply is low and demand goes up and everybody has to pay more and everybody freaked out, right? Now, a better question, though, too, is why was this going on? A lot of it has to do with the fact of a monoculture disease, right? Well, first of all, why the potato? Why is the potato such a big deal? Because they began giving the potato to poor farmers in a lot of different areas all over Europe, including Prussia, Austria, and Ireland, because it was a cheap crop to grow to feed the people that were growing wheat and grain stores, right? Because to make 2 pounds of potato, all you need is 1 square inch of potato, right? Like that's it. One with an eye on it, and then it'll grow more. But the thing about it is how many types of potato were they growing? You guessed it, one, right? They were growing what is known as the common brown potato, right? And this, friends, is known as a monoculture, right? As in you are growing one type of plant in an entire area. So if a disease comes around that affects that one type of plant, you got a problem on your hands, you got a famine, all right? Because how did people avoid this in the past? Well, the Incans are the ones that actually developed the potato for harvesting and growing and human consumption hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. How did they avoid that? By growing a lot of different types of potatoes. They grew 129 different varieties of potatoes. So if one type was affected, they had a bunch of other ones to eat. But they didn't do that in Ireland, Austria, Prussia, and other areas where they were actually using like this to feed workers, right? So this ends up leading to a massive wave and a shock wave going through Europe, which results in massive immigration, death from starvation, stillbirthing issues, which means people were having pregnancies that were actually the child was being born dead, and a rise in food prices all over the continent, right? Now, when we throw that ingredient in there, these terrible situations led to what is known as the revolutions of 1848, a massive wave of revolutions that went all over the continent and swept the entire area and led to people freaking out because there were 17 revolutions all at once, right? But we'll talk about all that stuff when I see you in class. Y'all have a good one.